Good evening and welcome to God Speaks. I'm your host, Markita Brooks, and I'm excited about this topic because tonight God says, "You are my treasure." Important topic because a lot of times we really miss the fullness of God's blessings, His favor, His love toward us. And He wants to share that tonight because He wants the whole world. He wants all of us to be His children, His sons and His daughters, but the choice is ours. We have to choose whether or not we want to follow God, whether we want to surrender to Him, whether we want to learn His ways, and whether we want to be His ambassadors in the earth. And so we're only going to look at 3 scriptures tonight, but all 3 talk about what it means to be God's treasure. He has chosen you. He calls you His treasure, but it's your choice to decide to be God's treasure in the earth. A treasure is going to stand out. It's going to be set apart, which means everyone is not going to choose to be God's treasure. There's got to be something about you that causes you to make that choice. And when I say something about you, I don't mean that He designed some people not to choose Him and He designed other people to choose Him. That's not at all what I mean. What I mean is you have to give your heart and your mind to Him that He might minister to you, transform you, and draw you to Himself, that you would choose to be His treasure. And so we want to look at these 3 scriptures that really make very clear who these people are that are God's treasure. What does it look like if we choose to be among that group, those people that are treasured by God? And so we're going to start in 1 Peter chapter 2, of course. We'll be looking at verses 9 and 10 to see one of the first requirements of being that treasure of God. Now, we've got 3 scriptures that we're going to look at. And so as God talks about His treasure, He's talking about Israel. He's talking about the ecclesia, the set apart people who come from among Israel and the nations, which means then anyone born of woman on the earth could be God's treasure if you realize that He's chosen and called you and you choose Him back. And so it becomes important that we get an understanding of that as we're going into knowing that you are called to be His treasure. He sees you as His treasure. You have to choose to be His treasure. So here we are in 1 Peter chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 9 and 10 out of the Complete Jewish Bible. And you want to get an understanding that he's talking about this spiritual house of priests that's being set apart for God. That's what this whole chapter is about, this spiritual priesthood, these people that are being set apart to God, that God is building up. He says it in earlier in verse 5, that we're being set apart, and he talks about this foundation stone upon which we are built, of course, which is Messiah Yeshua. He is the cornerstone. He is the stone that the builders rejected. He's become a stumbling block for those who rejected Him. But then he talks to the rest of us, those who have chosen Him. He chose us, but we choose Him back. And he says, you're not like those disobedient who stumbled on this truth, this word. So in verse 9, he says, but you are a chosen people, the king's Kohanim, which means the king's priests. And in other versions, it says a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God to possess. And in other versions, it says His special possession. Why? In order for you to declare the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Before you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Now, what's so interesting is that, of course, we see this in 1 Peter chapter 2. And so clearly Peter is talking to the ecclesia, the set apart ones from all the nations. So again, as we see in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul tells us very clearly that, you were not a people. You were estranged from God. You were away from Him. You were without His grace and His favor. But now you've been drawn into fellowship with Him, and you're co-citizens with the children of Israel, and you're together. You're being built into a spiritual house where God can dwell by His Spirit. This is Ephesians chapter 2. So we see what's happening when we get into this first century here. that God is calling the nations to himself, not just Israel anymore. He's calling everyone to himself, people who once were afar off, people who once were estranged from his Torah, estranged from the ways of the God of Israel. Now they're being drawn near to God. So there's this wonderful affirmation to know that I was not a part of God's people. I didn't know his ways. I didn't keep his Torah. I followed other ways and I came from other peoples, but he has sought me out and has drawn me to himself. Whatever sin I was in, whatever issues I had, whatever I've done, or whoever I had chosen to be, God says to me, I've chosen you. And now he puts in my heart this desire to choose him back, to say, yes, Lord, I accept that I'm your chosen possession. I'm your special treasure. I am set apart from the world, and I'm holy unto you, that I might give a testimony to the rest of the world of what it looks like when God reaches into the dark places, pulls people out, and shines his light on them. Not only is his light then on us, but he puts his light in us that we're able to shine light throughout the world. This light gives glory to God because we were in darkness. This is what Peter tells us in this chapter, 1 Peter chapter 2. But you think that that word is only for Gentiles. You think that that word is only for those who came into fellowship with Messiah, but were not a part of the children of Israel. But when we go to the very first time that God says this treasured possession, this special treasure, these treasured people, he says it in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now, I'm going to read these verses to you, but I'm going to tell you how closely they relate to 1 Peter chapter 2, much more than we would often think. So in Exodus chapter 19, they are in the Sinai desert at the base of Mount Sinai. The Lord is about to show up in thunder and lightning. He's about to reveal himself to them on the first Shavuot, the first of the revelation of himself to his people, because that's what happens on Shavuot, is he reveals himself to his people. Shavuot is also known as Pentecost. And so here we are in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. The Lord is speaking to Moses, and he says, now if you will pay careful attention to what I say and keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure from among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you will be a kingdom of Kohanim. It's the same word again, a kingdom of priests. For a kingdom of Kohanim for me, a nation set apart. These are the words you are to speak to the people of Israel. So when he was talking to Moses, he was telling him what to tell the children of Israel. This wasn't just for Moses, it was for the entire nation. He said, you will be a set apart nation for me. You'll be a kingdom of priests. Same language that Peter uses in 1 Peter chapter 2. Now, what becomes important to note here is because we go, of course they're set apart to him. They're his people. They're the children of Israel. But you have to get an understanding of their relationship with God. We want to start with the beginning of his creation of Israel. We see in Genesis, the Tower of Babel, and people were in Babylon. That's where Babel is. And they were building this tower to reach to the heavens, though they had not sought God. So they were trying to elevate themselves without God's direction, without submitting to him, without connecting with him, even with that same pride in their heart that the enemy had, to make themselves like the Most High. They wanted to make a name for themselves. And so, of course, God scatters them, gives them different languages, and scatters them throughout the face of the earth. But after this time, he decides to set apart a people for himself. And he chooses one man, Avram, who later becomes Abraham. Now, Avram was from Ur of the Chaldees, which means he was from Babylon. He was Babylonian. And present-day Babylon is Iraq. So he was Iraqi. And we get this understanding of where he is coming from. There's idolatry in his land. They worship many gods, just like everyone else on the earth was at that time. And one man says, I'm going to follow you, Lord. I'm going to serve you alone. I want to know your ways. And so God starts to draw this one man, Avram, to himself. What's important to note about this is that Avram was a Gentile. In fact, at this time on the earth, everybody was. So he was from the nations, from Babylon at that, the very place where the Tower of Babel had been erected. This is where he's from. He's from Babylon. God calls him out of Babylon, and he says, I'm going to set apart a nation through you. I'm going to bless the whole earth through you. he chooses this one man. This is now Genesis chapter 12, where he chooses Avram and he sets him apart and he tells him he's going to bless the whole earth through him. Now, from that one man, he starts to give revelation of his covenant. So they get the Brit Milah, which is the covenant of circumcision, and they get some of the Torah. They get lots of different revelation of the Torah. And so when Moses receives the fullness of it, that wasn't the first time any of it had first come forth, because of course we know Avram, he tithes. You see later on that his descendant Jacob tithes, and so we see that there was some of the Torah already being revealed. And so this man learns more and more and more of God's ways, and he teaches God's ways to his sons. He has two, Ishmael and Isaac. And then, of course, Ishmael is sent away, and he later moves into Saudi Arabia. And so then Isaac continues the promise, and then he has two sons, Esau and Jacob. And then, of course, God chooses Jacob to give the promise to, and then from him, he changes Jacob's name to Israel, and then he sets apart the children of Israel. But even in that moment, they're wanderers in the earth. They haven't actually inherited the promised land. They hit a famine. Joseph is sent down into Egypt as a slave, sold into slavery by his brothers, all of these being Jacob's sons. And then finally, of course, God raises Joseph up in Egypt. And Joseph then sends for Jacob and the rest of their family. They all move into Egypt. And then this nation of Israel develops in sort of this covered, protected place away from the rest of the world, outside of the promised land. So they're among the nations in the world superpower, which is Egypt. And this nation starts to grow and grow and grow in sort of an incubator, where even though there was harsh treatment and slavery and oppression, children of Israel continue to flourish. That tells us in Exodus chapter 1, they keep flourishing. They keep being fruitful and multiplying. They keep being blessed by God despite the harsh circumstances. And so now they've been in slavery for 430 years to the day, how long they've been in Egypt. And then God brings them out. They're wandering in the desert, don't know what's going to happen, not really. And they're waiting for this unseen God to reveal his ways to them. This is where we are in Exodus chapter 19. So even though, at this point, we know Israel is God's chosen people, set apart. At this point, they're slaves, and they don't really have a national identity, and they're getting to know God, just like we see the Gentiles doing in the first century that Peter's writing to in 1 Peter chapter 2. Point being that when God calls people his treasure, they usually don't have a concept of the fact that they are his yet. They're coming out of bondage, slavery, idolatry, wickedness. They're coming out of the nations, the world, worldliness, all types of influences that are actually opposing to God and his kingdom. And then he says, I'm pulling you out of this. And he does, in fact, pull them out. He pulls Israel out. We see that in the book of Exodus, of course. He pulls the Gentiles of the nations, the ecclesia. He pulls them out, which is later transliterated into the church. He pulls the Gentiles out from idolatry, out from paganism, and worshiping multiple gods. And he says, serve the one God, only the God of Israel. It makes very clear which one God it is. And they choose him, and he's identified by the sacrificed son, Messiah Yeshua, and they choose him. And then he says, you are my treasured possession. And so the reason God is having me to point this out to you at this moment is because when we look at these scriptures, Exodus chapter 19, we look at 1 Peter chapter 2, and we hear God say things like, you are the king's priests, a royal priesthood, treasured possession, set apart nation. We hear these things. We think about people who are holy and worthy and understand some things. They're knowledgeable and they have this great relationship with God. But what I'm going to share with you is that that's not true of either of those groups. They were both just recently pulled out of either bondage to Egypt or bondage to sin. Both had been slaves. And he said, I'm setting you free. And the reason this is important is because even if you think you're free, because the children of Israel at the time of Yeshua's ministry thought they were free too. They were like, we're sons of Abraham. We've never been slaves of anyone. And he said, anyone who sins is a slave of sin. So even if you think you're free, there's probably something in your life that you're enslaved to in some kind of way. God has pulled you and is yet pulling you out. And the reality is you can't pull yourself out. And so being pulled out of that darkness, oppression, abuse, slavery, bondage, sin, idolatry, whatever you've been involved in, depression, poverty, whatever has been holding you back, whatever kept you out of relationship with God, whatever made you estranged from him and his ways, he is pulling you out of it. And as he pulls you out, because they weren't completely free in their minds here in Exodus 19. We know because later on, like really just later on in this chapter, they say to Moses, listen, God is terrifying. We don't understand him. You talk to him. We're not going to talk to him. You go talk to him. And later on, God has to set apart from among them the Levites because the children of Israel were afraid to approach him. So we see that they weren't as free as we'd like to think they are. Oh, they were the children of Israel. Or, oh, they were the early church, the early ecclesia, and all this. These people were struggling. They still had bondage in their minds, bondage in their lives, all types of issues happening all around them. The early church or the early ecclesia lived right among sin. One of the letters to the early churches in Revelation says, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. We know, of course, Timothy had to deal with the idolatry right there in Ephesus. He was even later on, we find out, martyred because of all the worship there. And he was so just hurt by it that he was protesting the idolatry, and he's martyred. And so they're living right in the midst of sin and even struggling with it themselves. They're struggling with their identities. They're struggling with this relationship with this God that they can't see, that they're trying to trust, and they're learning to get to know. That they've got a covenant with him. He's made covenant with them. He's saying, I'm bringing you out, so I'm making covenant with you and keep my covenant. And they're like, what is this covenant? What are your ways, God? Teach us your ways. We don't really know your ways. And he says, you're my treasured possession. The reality of that is absolutely amazing. That God would call slaves out of bondage, call people out of horrible sin. Say, I'm going to bring you out of darkness and into light. I'm going to call you my treasured possession. I'm going to put my light on you, which is favor, and my light in you, which is his Holy Spirit. And you're going to testify to the nations right there where you are. I'm going to bless you, and they're going to watch you be a blessing. This is what brings God glory, not what we think. We always think it's those perfect, holy, absolutely righteous and religious people who know all the right things to do. And I'm not saying we should not keep letting him transform us by the renewing of our minds, because we should. We've got to keep growing and get better and better and better. We don't stay in sin. We don't stay in the slavery mentality and bondage. But the reality is nobody starts there. Nobody starts there. And we walk this thing out for the entirety of our lives, learning his ways and living up to that whole treasured possession thing. But a key to all of this is to receive that he says it about you. He absolutely adores you, and he calls you his treasured possession. With all your issues, your background, he knows all about it. He knew about Israel's. He knows about yours. He knows about mine. And he still says, you are my treasured possession. You're special. You're set apart among the nations. And then he says, keep my covenant. Now, when he says, keep my covenant, we go, oh, there's the fine print. There it is. I knew you wanted something. You weren't just going to bless me. Now I got to keep your covenant. I got to keep your commandments. Got to do what you tell me to do. Oh, see, I knew it was a catch. But with God, it's not like that. He tells us to keep his covenant, but he does not withdraw his love because we don't. It's not a condition of the love. He tells us to keep his commandments because he knows that those commandments actually empower us to be the very people he designed us to be. When we break God's commandments, we are malfunctioning, and he knows that. He doesn't want us to malfunction. He doesn't want us to be self-destructive. Some self-destructive tendencies show up immediately. They start to destroy all types of stuff right around us. But other self-destructive tendencies don't show up immediately. They take years and years and years. So you get to be an elderly person, and then you look back and you go, oh my God, I've been destroying myself this whole time. Or even worse, I've been destroying other people. I've been destroying their souls, their lives, their trust and faith in God. And we can do that. If we can get close enough to people to love them and build their faith, we can also get close enough to hurt them and damage their faith in God. And so God says, keep my covenant, obey my commandments, because in them you will have life. Not only will you have life, but you will give life. You'll feed life to other people. You'll bring me glory because they'll want to know the God that is at work in you. It'll be a blessing to you, and it'll be a blessing to everybody around you. And in this way, you will operate as my treasured possession. I've already called you my treasure, but I want to teach you to function as a treasure. I want you to be a blessing to the earth. I want the entire earth to be blessed because I placed you here. And the only way that happens is if you obey my commandments. If you follow that which I put before you, if you listen for my voice in your ear, in your heart, in your mind, and you obey through trusting me, then will you be a light in the darkness. Then will you draw people unto me, that they too might be a light. Then the darkness in the earth will be overcome by light, which is multiplied in the hearts of men because you chose to follow me. That's God's will for all of us. That is how he wants to function in and through us. But we've got to choose him and his ways. He doesn't push it. He doesn't make us do it. He teaches us to do it. He draws us to it. He empowers us to do it. We can't keep his commandments without his Holy Spirit. It's not possible. He is the one that empowers us and enables us to keep his commandments. But now here's the challenge. If we've gotten to this place where we realize he says about me that I am his treasured possession. He's called me to act like his treasured possession, to think like his treasured possession, to have the heart motivations of his treasured possession. Then I've got to understand that there can be discouragement. Though I am acknowledging that I'm his treasured possession, he sees it, I see it, other people see it. I'm proclaiming him publicly. I'm not denying him. People know that I've chosen to follow God, and I've been redeemed by his son, Messiah Yeshua. People get that about me. It's out there. I still have to deal with some challenges that may come. And one of them deals with discouragement and complacency. Because the reality is, after I say yes to God, yes, I accept it, I'm your treasured possession. Yes, I want to walk like your treasure. I want to be blessed to be a blessing. I want your light within me, and I want to shed it abroad so that other people will be drawn to you as well. As soon as we say that, the enemy goes, oh, I need to shut that down. Because he rules in darkness. He doesn't want light, because light expels darkness. It, in fact, pushes it back. So he says, I've got to snuff them out so that they will walk away from God's light. I've got to weary them, got to discourage them. I've got to push them down and stomp on them so that they will not receive God's light within themselves. They won't shed it abroad to other people, and they'll reject the ways of God, thereby malfunctioning, that the light within them will become darkness, the testimonies will mean nothing, and I, the enemy, will get the glory. This is his whole plan. So here we are, Malachi chapter 3, which for me is actually what started the whole premise of this Bible study, because he spoke this to me. He spoke Malachi chapter 3 to me, and I had known for years and years and years. I've ministered this so many times that he calls us his treasured possession in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. And he calls us his treasured possession in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. But as many times as I've read Malachi chapter 3, I never saw it in Malachi chapter 3 until this week when he gave it to me. And what we've got to understand about the book of Malachi is that the whole book is to the priest. He's speaking to his priests. So these are the very ones who say, yes, yes, I am your treasured possession. Yes, I accept the call to walk as your treasured possession. Yes, I want you to continue to transform me, fill me with your light, that I would be your treasured possession, not just, saying something or trying to present a front, but I really want to be your treasured possession in the earth. I want to be set apart. I want to be the king's Kohanim, the king's priest, the royal priesthood. I want to be that person. I'm that guy. I'm that girl. Put me on the path and set me to it. So these are those people. And he starts out rebuking them. He rebukes them because they're no longer revering his name. They're bringing him worthless offerings. He rebukes them because they're breaking covenants with their wives. They're either divorcing them to marry younger women, or they're physically abusing them. And so God tells them, I hate divorce, and I hate a man covering over himself with violence as with a cloak. And then he tells them that he is calling them to account for the wife of their youth, because he made them one flesh so that they would have holy offspring, because he wanted those who called to be priests to make families of priests. So then these children are being raised up to be priests. But if there's divorce and violence and infidelity and broken covenants, and then it makes it so much harder for the children to see God in the midst of all that and to choose to receive from God that call to be a treasured possession as well. And so he's saying, you're malfunctioning. You're not operating out of that which I've placed in you. You're malfunctioning. But in Malachi chapter 3, it kind of tells us why they're malfunctioning. Like, he says, I'm going to send my messenger. I'm going to purify you Levites like silver and gold, and then your offerings are going to be acceptable to me. And he's saying, return to me. I've not rejected you. Come back to me and stop robbing me. And this is where we get, will the man rob God? And he talks about the tithes and the offerings, because the priests were not giving the tithes and offerings to God. And he says, of course, test me in this, and I'll open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that you would not have room enough to receive. But here is the kicker. This is why they were malfunctioning the way they were malfunctioning. So they've been taken out of slavery. He's been transforming them. So that's not the challenge anymore. There's a new challenge. Here's the new challenge. We're going to see it in verses 13 and 14 of Malachi chapter 3. Actually, it's 13 through 15. And this is what it says. You have spoken strongly against me. And other version says arrogantly against me, says Adonai, the Lord. Yet you say, how have we spoken against you? Verse 14, by saying, there is no point in serving God. What good is it to obey his orders or to walk about as mourners before Adonai Zavaot, which is the Lord God of hosts? We consider the arrogant happy. Also, evildoers prosper. They put God to the test. Nevertheless, they escape. So what has happened is they've become discouraged. After all this time, he's pulled them out of slavery. He's pulled them out of bondage. He's transformed them. He's put his light on them. He's put his light in them. They've been serving him, trying to be a light, trying to lead people to him. And here they are, discouraged, because they feel like everything they're doing is for nothing. And so this is why they weren't revering his name as they should. This is why they started to give him worthless offerings. This is why they were withholding the tithes and offerings. This is why they were divorcing and abusing their wives. They're breaking covenant with them. This is why they were malfunctioning, because they had got it in their hearts that it was useless to serve God, that there was no benefit to this sacrifice that they were doing. And the only reason why it feels like sacrifice, it's not a sacrifice when everyone and everything around us is serving God. It's a sacrifice when you live among sinners, when you live among the rebellious. And that's pretty much the world that we live in which case, if you choose to serve God, you're going to live among sinners. You're going to live among the rebellious. And it's going to be hard to serve God, because the enemy, again, as I shared with you, is going to target you to try to oppress you and depress you and discourage you, that you would turn away from the things of God. He wants to make it hard for you, because he doesn't want you sharing light, because it pushes back his kingdom of darkness. So an understanding of what this whole book of Malachi is all about. Why did God even feel that he needed to give this word to the prophet? Because his priests had become discouraged. And that discouragement, because they felt that, really, I'm not doing any good. Nobody around me is changing. They don't even see the need to change. They're prospering in their wickedness. Why am I sacrificing? Why am I going about, mourning over this sin? I could just enjoy life and make covenant with the wicked and just do the same stuff they're doing. Because that's when it becomes hard for believers. God doesn't make it hard for believers. But when people in high places are wicked, they make it hard for believers because they really want you to be like them. Just by the fact that you are doing God's will, it convicts them. So they don't want you to do God's will. They want you to sin a little bit. Hey, take a drink, say a little cuss words, and dance at this dance party. And they want you to sin because it makes them feel better about themselves and their own sin. And so they make it hard for you to really keep God's commandments, and keep enticing you to not keep God's commandments because it makes them feel better if they can get you to do what they're doing. Because your holiness convicts them automatically, whether you say anything or not. Just the holiness within you convicts. But that's what it's supposed to do. But the challenge is that the rebellious around God's people make life hard for God's people. We got to trade with them. We got to interact with them. And the enemy uses them to make life hard for us. And so they're saying, man, this is ridiculous. I just need to quit. It's just no use. I'm tired of doing this. I'm tired of seeking God and all the warfare that comes with it, and all the backlash that comes from people around me. I'm just going to live like everybody else is living. And they start doing that. So the discouragement leads them to complacency. And this is what God is rebuking them for. But once he hit on what the real issue was, which was discouragement, that was the reason they were sinning and rebelling against God and profaning his name, breaking covenants with their wives, all the things they were doing, was because they were discouraged in their call. They were discouraged about who he said they were. Once he put his finger on it, he says, I know that's why you're doing it. They repent. Verse 16 says, then those who feared Adonai spoke together. They reasoned with one another. It says, and Adonai listened and heard. A record book was written in his presence for those who feared Adonai and had respect for his name. So they were already Levites. They were already set apart. They were already his treasure. But their discouragement turned to complacency. God rebuked them, and now they're repenting. And verse 17 says, they will be mine, says Adonai Zeva'ot. On the day when I compose my own special treasure, I will spare them as a man spares his own son who serves him. Verse 18 is really important. Then once again, you will see the difference between the righteous and the wicked, between the person who serves God and the one that doesn't serve him. And so God is saying to them, listen, because you've repented, because he said, return to me. He said it earlier in this chapter in verse 3 of Malachi, and verse 7 of Malachi chapter 3, he says, return to me. So he's asking them to repent. When they repent, he says, you'll be my treasure again. And he says, I'm going to spare you, meaning you will be the remnant. Among the challenging times to come, you will be the remnant. And when my judgments hit the earth, you're going to see the difference between the righteous and the wicked. Your service, your sacrifice, your stand for me, your consistent faithfulness will pay off. You will see the difference between the wicked and the righteous. They're not going to keep prospering forever. They're not going to get away with sin and hurting people forever. You're going to see a difference. This is what God is promising them. And this is what God is promising you. Whether you're at the beginning of your journey and he's having to convince you that you're a treasured possession, or if you've been serving God for a long time and sometimes you get a little weary, sometimes you get a little discouraged, sometimes you start to waver in keeping his commandments because it doesn't seem like it's worth it. God is saying to you, return to me. You are my treasured possession. It's not going to be this way always. Challenging times are coming, but the reality is, Malachi chapter 4 tells us, in those challenging times, the day of the Lord, God will make a serious distinction between those who serve him and those who don't. So you will be glad that you served him. In fact, he says that his people will leap like calves released from a stall. And so it becomes important that we get that there will be a day of rejoicing for those who choose to continue to walk in his ways. That light is going to shine forth like the sun shining forth at the dawn of the day. It's going to be bright, the light within you. The darkness will not be able to overcome it. And so this word tonight is to encourage you to either receive for the first time that you are his treasure, or to recommit to the reality that he's called you to be his treasure, He's empowered you to be his treasure, and he needs your light to go forth in all the earth, even amidst the darkness. In fact, because of the darkness. I hope that encouraged you, and I hope that it will cause you to recommit or commit for the first time to the ways of God, because he needs ambassadors, he needs light bearers, that we might carry his light throughout the earth. I pray that you'll join us soon. This weekend we have our prophetic roundtable at 2 p.m. at Temple of Peace Church at 3115 Wickham Avenue in Newport News, Virginia, where I'm inviting prophets and even those who are not exactly prophetic people, because we all can speak words of knowledge. And all of us can share a revelation that God gives us, because we prophesy in part. And so I want to encourage you to consider joining us at 2 p.m. this Saturday. For the next 2 Saturdays after that, November 14th and November 11th, we'll be having our deliverance and spiritual healing ministry training, which I'm going to tell you is an amazing training. You will receive deliverance, and you'll learn how to minister deliverance to other people in your life, either in your personal life or in your ministry. And so it's very important for all believers that you join us for that training. So you can register online, or you can just join us on those days. But you do want to come to both, because the 11th is going to build on what was taught on the 4th. So you want to come to the 4th, and you also want to come to the 11th. And those trainings are from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. We start early because we need to get all 4 hours in. So those trainings are from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. on November 4th and 11th at the same place, Temple of Peace Church, at 3115 Wickham Avenue in Newport News, Virginia. If you ever have questions about where we are or what we're doing, visit our website, truthinspirit.org, because we want to connect with you. We want to fellowship with you. We want to bless you that you might be a blessing. We want to speak more life into you. We want to empower you to speak life into others. I also want to encourage you to visit our website to give, or bring tithes, offerings, first fruits, monthly partnerships with you to our upcoming services, because God is expanding this ministry and we cannot do it without your help. We need to raise $3,000 by October 28th, and every month thereafter, our monthly partnership needs to increase by $2,500 so that we can go to the next level. Lord has opened a door for an international ministry to really help us go right to the next level. I've been invited into their inner circle, and God has just shown us favor as he prophesied that he would. And so it is the season. It's time for us to do it. They're excited that we're coming on board. Actually, I actually shared with them that we are coming on board, and they're praying with us because we've got to sow into their ministry as they're planning to sow into this ministry. Also, there's some things that this ministry has to let go of, that we can focus our energies on this, which is why your giving is so important. We've absolutely got to do this because God is placing it before us, but we can't do it without your support. And so I pray again that this Bible study blessed you, that you will be blessed to be a blessing, and that God will minister to your heart to be a blessing back into this ministry that sows into you weekly, or even more than weekly if you join us for services as well. And so I do pray that we'll connect with you soon, and I pray that you stay blessed, and remember that you are his treasured possession.